They came with pitchforks, not swords. No armor, no cavalry, just rage. Entire noble estates burned, castles fell, and for a brief moment, the peasants were no longer beneath anyone's boot. This wasn't just another failed uprising. It was a moment when the entire foundation of feudal power shook. And if one message echoed louder than the church bells that rang in panic, it was this: we are not afraid anymore. By the early 14th century, medieval Europe was teetering on the edge. Beneath the surface of church bells and feudal rituals, daily life for most people, especially peasants, was marked by hunger, disease, and hopelessness. The foundation of feudal society rested on a rigid hierarchy: kings at the top, nobles beneath them, and the peasantry bearing the weight of it all. But by the mid-1300s, this balance had started to crack. The Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed somewhere between 30% to 60% of the population. Entire villages disappeared. Fields went untilled. Livestock rotted where they stood. The labor force collapsed overnight, but the demands of the ruling class did not. Lords, desperate to maintain income from their estates, imposed harsher obligations. On surviving peasants, fixed rents were replaced with forced labor. Customary protections were ignored. Those who tried to move or seek better terms elsewhere were hunted down, fined, or imprisoned. In England, this tension took on a legislative form. The Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351, aimed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and punish any labourer who demanded more. The laws criminalized basic negotiation. Meanwhile, inflation and food shortages continued. Famine had already devastated the continent in the earlier part of the century, especially during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when torrential rains wiped out harvests and drove even the wealthier classes into desperation. Now, plague had layered catastrophe upon catastrophe. War made matters worse. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337, drained resources from both crowns. Taxes rose steeply. In England, a particularly aggressive poll tax was levied multiple times between 1377 and 1381, hitting every individual over the age of 15, rich or poor. But exemptions were common for the well-connected. The burden landed squarely on the working poor. Collection was brutal and invasive. Government agents often used physical coercion, sparking immediate resentment in towns and villages already under pressure. Religion offered little comfort. The church, which had long been a source of guidance and spiritual protection, suffered a loss of legitimacy during the plague. Priests died in droves. Many bishops and abbots abandoned their posts. Others profited by offering plague pardons for a fee. To the average peasant, the church began to resemble the nobility: wealthy, corrupt, and indifferent. Disillusionment spread. The social contract, unwritten but once accepted, was unraveling. Nobles expected obedience in return for protection, but in the eyes of the peasants, protection had failed. Famine, plague, war, and poverty had struck them hardest, and those at the top either ignored their suffering or profited from it. In towns across France, England, and the German states, small acts of defiance multiplied. Villagers refused to pay taxes. Manorial courts were ignored. Gangs of peasants began attacking officials, destroying records, and forcing landlords to make concessions. Though scattered, these incidents hinted at something larger: a growing awareness that the system was not unshakable. The pressure built slowly, like steam behind a sealed door. And by the late 14th century, it was no longer a question of whether a rebellion would come, but where it would erupt first. In the years following the Black Death, rural villages across England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire began to shift. It didn't start with banners or swords. It started with silence, with withheld labor, with whispers in the alehouses. Discontent no longer hid behind prayer or fear. Fields were left unsown, tax collectors chased away, and manor houses found their barns emptied by moonlight. In Kent and Essex, southern England officials began recording strange behavior. In 1377, royal agents noted that peasants in Fobbing refused to pay a newly enforced poll tax. When John Brampton, a tax commissioner, arrived to collect it, he was met with defiance, pushed out of the village, and his escort attacked. The event was small, localized, but the reaction in London was telling. The matter was brushed off. Just another case of rural rudeness, they thought. But the same patterns emerged again in nearby Brentwood, then Gravesend, then Rochester. In each case, peasants resisted not just taxation but the legal apparatus that supported it, tearing up court rolls, destroying documents that defined their servitude. The paper trails that tied them to the land and its obligations were suddenly being burned. That was more than vandalism. It was the erasure of feudal identity. Across the Channel, similar unrest simmered. In 1358, long before England's poll taxes sparked revolt, northern France had already witnessed its own shockwave. The jacquerie, named after the derisive term Jacques Bonhomme, used by nobles for peasants, erupted in the Ile-de-France region. The killing of a nobleman by villagers in St. Louis-Desserent spread rapidly into a coordinated massacre of landowners, their families, and their retainers. Over 100 castles were attacked in a matter of weeks. The uprising was crushed quickly by the nobility, but the memory of it lingered. In hushed tones and watchful glances, peasants remembered that for a few days, lords had been afraid to ride out. Peasant complaints were increasingly recorded in manorial rolls and court documents. In 1379, labourers complained openly in Norfolk that we are oppressed by talliages and other services more than ever before, though there are fewer of us. The argument was logical. The plague had reduced their numbers. Their labour was now more valuable, yet their treatment grew harsher, not better. Religious dissent mirrored social unrest. The sermons of John Ball, an English priest already imprisoned multiple times, called for the levelling of society. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, he asked. His question wasn't theoretical. It challenged the very structure of feudal hierarchy. And though Ball's influence was marginal in the early years, his words spread in taverns, town squares, and churchyards, quietly building a new kind of literacy, one in which peasants began to see the order around them not as divine, but man-made. To nobles and royal officials, these were isolated incidents, undisciplined villages, loud-mouthed clerics, unpaid taxes, nothing that couldn't be corrected with a sheriff or a gallows. But what they failed to see was that these sparks were not dying out. They were catching fire. In June of 1381, southern England erupted. The uprising didn't begin with an army, it began with a refusal. In the village of Fobbing, in Essex, government official John Brampton arrived to collect the poll tax. But the villagers didn't just protest, they drove him out. News spread fast. The next day, When reinforcements were sent to restore order, they too were met with violence. Within days, a wave of resistance rolled through Essex and Kent, gathering force with every mile. The tax had been the final insult. Imposed in 1377, and again in 1379. It was resurrected for a third time in 1381, but this time it was enforced with ruthless precision. Every adult, regardless of income, was to pay. The collection methods were intrusive and often humiliating. In many cases, tax agents demanded physical inspections to determine age or marital status, sparking outrage, particularly among women and their families. For a society already stretched by war levies, inflation, and decades of hardship, the poll tax crossed a line. Rebels moved swiftly, attacking manorial records, freeing prisoners, and targeting symbols of state authority. Their ranks swelled, with laborers, artisans, and even some disaffected townsmen. Two names soon rose above the chaos: Wat Tyler and John Ball. Wat Tyler, from Kent, is believed to have taken leadership after the burning of manor houses and the execution of royal officials in his region. He had military discipline and the ability to command crowds. He wasn't a noble, nor a priest. He was one of them. His appeal rested in clarity: land, fair wages, and an end to serf dog. John Ball, recently released from Archbishop Sudbury's prison, had long preached against the hierarchy of church and crown. His sermons had been banned, but now, in the open air before thousands, he repeated the line that had already become a motto: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The rebels were not aimless. Their movements were coordinated. From Essex, they marched toward London. From Kent, they took Rochester, Canterbury, and Maidstone. Along the way, they stormed jails, executed officials, including men like Simon of Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and burned tax registers. It was not indiscriminate destruction. They focused on destroying the legal and financial systems that bound them to servitude. By mid-June, an estimated 30,000 rebels encircled London. King Richard II, just 14 years old, met with them at Mile End on June 14th. Promises were made. Serfdom would be abolished. Justice would be delivered. The crowd began to disperse. But the next day, when Tyler met the King's party again at Smithfield to demand further reforms, events turned violent. Accounts differ, but most agree. Tyler was attacked and killed, either by William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, or the King's men. Leaderless and sensing betrayal, the rebel force dissolved. Within weeks, royal forces hunted down the remaining instigators. Hundreds were executed, yet for days the capital had belonged not to knights or barons, but to men with no title at all. The revolt had not overturned the monarchy, but it had terrified it. The ruling elite had seen what organized, motivated commoners could achieve, and it left them shaken. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was not just a local disturbance. It was a warning. The summer of 1381 shattered the illusion of noble invincibility. As rebel forces marched on London, the ruling class scrambled for answers. What they saw across the countryside wasn't scattered unrest, it was organized fury. Whole towns had flipped their allegiance overnight. Royal agents were hunted. Castles that once stood as symbols of power were looted, burned, or abandoned. The nobility, long accustomed to being feared, suddenly found themselves in hiding in Essex. The manor of Sir Robert Hales, Lord High Treasurer of England, was among the first to be attacked. Hales had been one of the chief architects of the hated poll tax. Rebels stormed his estate, destroyed his belongings, and burned the manor to the ground. Hales himself fled to the Tower of London, seeking safety behind its thick walls. But even the Tower, the most fortified symbol of royal authority, wasn't untouchable. On June 14th, rebel forces entered London with almost no resistance. City gates were opened from the inside. Sympathetic citizens, apprentices, and labourers joined the rural crowds. The line between city and countryside dissolved. That same day, the Savoy Palace, the opulent home of John of Gaunt, the king's powerful uncle, was ransacked and set ablaze. The building was one of the grandest in England. Rebels destroyed it brick by brick, but they looted nothing. Gold and jewels were thrown into the Thames. This wasn't theft, it was retribution. Inside the Tower of London, panic took hold. King Richard II, only 14 years old, was under protection along with senior officials and clergy. On June 14th, while the king met rebels at Mile End, a separate rebel faction breached the tower. No army, no siege engines, just open gates and a population too afraid or too aligned to resist. Once inside, the rebels found Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Sir Robert Hales. Both were dragged out and executed on Tower Hill. Their heads were paraded through the streets on pikes. The Tower, the last refuge of the elite, had fallen without a fight. In towns across the southeast, the story was the same. At St. Albans, rebels forced the abbot to grant them a charter of liberties. At Bury St. Edmunds, the unpopular prior was hunted down and killed. In Norfolk, the judge, Sir John Cavendish, was executed by a mob in Bury after fleeing from Lakenheath. His attempt to escape by boat was thwarted by locals who recognized him and delivered him back into the hands of the rebels. The nobility underestimated the coordination, the anger, and the reach of the rebellion. They assumed their titles, their walls, and their authority would shield them. Instead, they were surrounded by people who no longer saw them as untouchable. Power, once protected by distance and ritual, had been dragged into the streets. For the first time in centuries, England's elite weren't ruling. They were running in the streets of London and the fields of Kent. The voice of the commoner was no longer a whisper. It was a demand, clear, coordinated, and deeply rooted in lived reality. For decades, peasants had labored under a system that treated them as property, not people. The uprising of 1381 didn't emerge from chaos alone. It was driven by ideas, and those ideas, for the first time, were spoken aloud, not just in taverns or villages, but before the crown itself, at Mile End on June 14th. The rebels presented their terms directly to King Richard II. The demands were written, not shouted. They called for the complete abolition of serfdom. No man, they argued, should be bound to labor on another's land by birth. They demanded the right to rent land at fair market rates, free from arbitrary feudal dues, and they called for the removal of corrupt royal officials and justices, those who had exploited their positions to enrich themselves while enforcing brutal laws on the poor. These were not vague appeals. They were specific. They sought the end of villanage, the legal status that tied peasants to manors and made their labor compulsory. In medieval law, villeins could not leave their land without permission. They could be taxed, fined, or conscripted at will. The rebellion's leaders understood exactly what that status meant, and they wanted it gone. The ideological engine behind these demands was partly shaped by radical sermons and thinkers. None more prominent than John Ball, a priest excommunicated multiple times for his preaching. Paul had long challenged the church's complicity in social injustice. After being freed from prison by the rebels, he became their de facto chaplain. His message was simple: divine law made no man superior to another. His sermons quoted scripture, but pointed them squarely at inequality. Things cannot go well in England, he said, until all goods are held in common and there are no more lords or vassals. This philosophy resonated, not because it was abstract, but because it addressed daily suffering. Paul's words transformed rebellion into moral argument. Peasants weren't just protesting taxes, they were asserting a new vision of justice, and that justice demanded an end to hereditary power, land-based oppression, and legal subjugation. Among the rebel petitions were calls for the end of the game laws, which criminalized peasant hunting on aristocratic land. They also sought reform of the legal system, one that fined the poor and favored the wealthy. They wanted freedom of movement, freedom from bonded labor, and the right to earn and keep wages. These were revolutionary ideas in a society where law and status were inherited. The peasants weren't seeking to overthrow the monarchy itself. They were challenging the structure beneath it, the network of landlords, judges, and clerics that controlled wealth, mobility, and justice for the first time in recorded English history. The poorest people in the kingdom had not only risen in revolt, they had delivered a manifesto, a list of demands that questioned the very shape of power. And though the rebellion would not last, the clarity of their voice would echo far beyond the fields of 1381, ChatGPT said. By mid-June 1381, England's capital resembled a city under siege, but there were no foreign banners, no siege engines at the gates. The threat came from within. Tens of thousands of rebels, drawn from Kent, Essex, and beyond, had flooded into London, armed not with discipline or formal training, but with fury and numbers. Their targets were precise: tax collectors, royal judges, church officials, anyone seen as the face of the system that had oppressed them. The first real blow landed with the fall of the Savoy Palace. It wasn't just a residence. It was the most lavish home in the kingdom, belonging to John of Gaunt, uncle to the king and a symbol of unchecked noble power. The mob showed no interest in looting. Gold, silver, and tapestries were cast into the Thames. What they wanted was destruction. The palace was set ablaze from within. Wine cellars were smashed. Explosives, likely gunpowder from the armory, were lit. The entire structure was reduced to smoking rubble. It was a message. Wealth and lineage no longer guaranteed safety, but it didn't stop at property. On June 14th, as King Richard II met with rebels at Mile End and offered vague concessions, a second faction breached the Tower of London. It had never been taken by force in living memory, yet on that day it was entered without resistance. Gates opened. Guards either fled or stood aside. Inside were some of the most powerful men in the realm, and their deaths were swift. Archbishop Simon Sudbury, also Lord Chancellor of England, was dragged from the chapel where he had been at prayer. Sir Robert Hales, the Lord High Treasurer, followed. Both were beheaded on Tower Hill. Their heads were placed on poles and paraded through the city. John Legge, a royal tax commissioner, was also executed. Across the capital, lesser officials were hunted down and killed, many by their own neighbors who had traveled from the countryside to join the uprising. For a brief moment, there was no functioning government. City authorities offered little resistance. Many sympathized with the rebellion. Others were too afraid to act. The lines between peasant, townsman, and rebel blurred. London's own apprentices joined the cause, turning the city's unrest into a movement that crossed class and regional lines. Noble households barricaded themselves. Those who could fled the city entirely. Rumors circulated that the entire ruling structure was about to collapse, that Parliament would be dissolved, the royal family replaced, or the land redistributed. But beneath the momentum was a growing instability. Coordination between rebel groups began to break down. Disciplines slipped. Some used the chaos for personal revenge. Others were unsure what to do now that their demands had reached the king. Still, in that moment, between the burning of the Savoy and the blood spilled at Tower Hill, it was not unimaginable that the feudal order could fall. The peasants were not pleading, they were in control. For those few days, England's hierarchy was not just challenged, it was dismantled, street by street. As the rebels tightened their grip on London, cracks beneath the surface began to widen. The movement that had surged with single-minded energy now faced its own internal divisions. There was no central command, no unified strategy beyond shared anger and demands for justice. That lack of structure, which had once made the rebellion unpredictable and agile, now became its greatest weakness. Some rebels, particularly from Kent under Wat Tyler, pushed for sweeping structural changes: abolition of serfdom, redistribution of church lands, even the end of the aristocracy itself. Others, especially from Essex, were more cautious. They sought relief from oppressive taxes and legal constraints, but remained hesitant to challenge the monarchy or the broader social hierarchy outright. As these factions converged in the capital, disagreements multiplied. Coordination broke. Down at the same time, many rebels placed an extraordinary amount of faith in King Richard II, barely 14 years old. He presented himself at Mile End and again at Smithfield as calm, receptive, even sympathetic. His promise to abolish serfdom and deliver justice was taken at face value by many a move that, in hindsight, proved fatally naive. The monarchy was playing for time. While some rebels celebrated the king's concessions, others were already suspicious. On June 15th, Tyler returned to Smithfield to press for further guarantees. What happened there remains contested. Contemporary accounts suggest he approached the king confidently, perhaps too much so. Tensions flared. Words were exchanged between Tyler and members of the royal party. Then William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, struck Tyler down with a sword. Accounts vary. Some say Tyler was only wounded, others that he was killed on the spot. Either way, the message was unmistakable. The rebel force, watching from nearby fields, panicked. Richard II, flanked by soldiers, rode forward and declared himself their true leader. He promised protection if they dispersed, with their figurehead removed and no clear alternative leadership. The rebels hesitated, then began to retreat. Without Tyler, the cohesion dissolved. Smaller groups broke off, unsure whether to fight, negotiate, or flee. The confidence that had driven them into the capital now gave way to confusion. Promised pardons and charters were distributed, and then quickly revoked once the rebels returned home. The revolt, once poised to rewrite the fabric of society, now stood vulnerable, not because of superior force or better arms, but because its foundation had never been fully unified. It wasn't crushed in battle. It unraveled. The uprising had barely ended when the counterstrike began. Within days of Wat Tyler's death at Smithfield, the crown moved swiftly. The same King Richard to who had stood before the rebels and promised freedom, now sanctioned a campaign of brutal suppression. Royal forces, sheriffs, and loyal lords were ordered to restore control, not through negotiation, but through blood. The king's first move was to revoke every concession granted during the revolt. The charters handed out at Mile End, which promised freedom from bondage and an end to serfdom, were declared null and void. They had been issued, the court claimed, under duress, and thus held no legal authority. The message was unambiguous. Obedience would be restored, and it would be done through punishment. Mass arrests followed across the southeastern counties. In Kent, Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk, rebel leaders and even suspected participants were rounded up. No formal trials, no mercy. In many cases, locals betrayed one another, hoping to escape their own punishment. Some peasants who had taken part in burning manorial records were executed within days. Others were imprisoned indefinitely. In Essex alone, over 200 rebels were arrested within weeks. The most visible and vocal figures were targeted first. John Ball, the radical priest whose sermons had helped ignite the revolt's ideology, was captured near Coventry. He was dragged back to St. Albans, where he faced trial for treason. The sentence was carried out in the most public and violent way available. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his limbs displayed as a warning. Rebel towns were collectively punished. In Norfolk, towns like Bury St. Edmunds and Norwich, which had shown sympathy or cooperation, were forced to pay heavy fines. Manorial courts resumed their authority. In many places, harsher laws followed. Serfdom wasn't reformed, it was reinforced. In a sharp reversal, labor conditions became even more oppressive than before. The betrayals ran deep. In some villages, royal agents returned with lists of those who had accepted charters of freedom. These documents, once symbols of liberation, were now used as evidence against them. Rebels who had laid down arms in good faith were hanged in public squares. In London, the hangings became a spectacle. Bodies were left on display for days, a visual reminder of the price of defiance. The nobility's message was not subtle. Power would not be negotiated. It would be reclaimed with violence, and the memory of rebellion would be stained with terror. But while the revolt had failed in its immediate goals, the ruling elite could not erase what had happened. For a few days, the peasants had taken the capital. They had executed royal officials, breached the Tower of London, and forced the king himself into negotiation. That moment could not be undone. The brutal reversal re-established control, but not security. The nobles had crushed the revolt, but they had seen what fear looked like from the other side. The peasants' revolt of 1381 was crushed. Its leaders were executed, its promises revoked, and its followers scattered or silenced. But its legacy would outlast its defeat, though the monarchy reasserted control and the nobility reimposed order. The psychological impact of the uprising was immediate and lasting. The ruling class had witnessed the unthinkable, coordinated resistance by commoners, capable of paralyzing the capital and forcing royal negotiation. The fear that gripped London during those days in June never fully faded from aristocratic memory. It reshaped how future unrest would be anticipated and addressed. Despite the brutality of the crackdown, the social order didn't return to its previous stability. While the legal framework of serfdom remained intact for decades, enforcement weakened. Lords and landowners, especially in regions affected by the revolt, became more cautious. In practice, many peasants gained greater mobility, if not by law, than by necessity. Labor shortages, already intensified by the Black Death, gave workers more bargaining power. Landlords struggling to maintain revenues often had no choice but to offer better terms to retain tenants. Wage controls, such as those mandated by the Statute of Labourers in 1351, became harder to enforce. Workers began moving where wages were higher, sometimes abandoning manorial ties altogether. In the decades following the revolt, labourers across England gradually transitioned into a freer class of tenant farmers. Villenage, though still legally recognised, began to erode. The revolt also left a mark on royal policy. Richard II and his successors took steps to reform local governance, in part to prevent similar uprisings. Local lords were encouraged to maintain better records, improve communication with the crown, and avoid the kind of abuses that had triggered the revolt. The government began to monitor rural discontent more closely. Fear of another uprising became a permanent feature of statecraft. Even ideologically, the rebellion reshaped public discourse. John Ball's sermons, preserved in chronicles and church condemnations, continued to circulate in altered forms. His message that no man was born a lord over another would resurface in later centuries, echoed by reformers, radicals, and revolutionaries, the peasants. Revolt failed to dismantle the feudal system in 1381, but it exposed its vulnerabilities. It shattered the illusion that the social order was unchangeable, and in doing so, it laid the foundation for a long, uneven decline of serfdom in England, not through declaration, but through pressure, resistance, and the slow erosion of fear. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 ended in defeat, but it raised a question that historians have continued to ask. Could it have succeeded? The scale was unprecedented. Tens of thousands mobilized in a matter of weeks. London was breached, government officials executed, and the monarchy forced into negotiations. But without centralized leadership, long-term strategy, or a unified vision, the rebellion could not sustain itself. Wat Tyler's death left a vacuum, and there was no second wave. Coordination broke down just as momentum reached its peak. Still, the potential was there. Had rebel groups maintained discipline, had they refused to trust royal promises, and had they seized the Tower of London as a political stronghold rather than a symbolic target, England's feudal system might have fractured more severely. Historian Rodney Hilton noted, what the rising lacked was not courage, but cohesion. If it had, it might have ended not in failure, but in revolution. The rebellion's demands were far from utopian. They called for an end to villainy, fair rents, and protection from corrupt officials, reforms that would slowly materialize over the next 2 centuries. What the revolt revealed was that these changes could have come far earlier, had the movement been more organized and its leadership sustained. Historian Alistair Dunn wrote, "For a brief moment, England's rulers glimpsed a world turned upside down. That glimpse was enough to shake them." Even in failure, the rebels had exposed how fragile the old order was. They had revealed that when the oppressed act together, not just in anger, but with purpose, the ground beneath monarchs and lords can shift. It didn't collapse in 1381, but the tremor never stopped.